I never thought that a small decision on a rainy evening in Seattle would become something that changed my life years later. If someone had asked me that day what it meant to not sue the person who had just crashed into my car, I probably would have shrugged and said it was nothing special. But now, looking back, I understand that that moment planted a seed I didn't even know I would need one day. That night, Seattle was entering the early days of autumn. The rain wasn't heavy, just tiny drops falling steadily onto the road. Streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, making the streets in Capitol Hill look like they were covered in a soft, yellow glow. I was driving back to my apartment near Lake Union after a long day at the tech company where I worked as a software engineer. My name is Luca Bennett. That year I was 34 years old. My life, at least on the surface, looked pretty stable. I had a good job, a steady income, and a small but comfortable apartment. But the truth was that ever since my father passed away 2 years earlier, there had been a quiet emptiness living inside my life. I still went to work every day, still talked to coworkers, still did the things I needed to do. But sometimes it felt like I was living on autopilot instead of actually living. That night I stopped at a red light at an intersection in Capitol Hill. The rain continued to fall lightly. I remember thinking about whether I should stop by a convenience store to grab some coffee. Everything felt completely ordinary until I heard a dull crash behind me. My car jolted slightly forward. I looked into the rearview mirror and saw an old gray sedan stopped right behind me. The front of it was almost touching my rear bumper. I sighed, opened my door, and stepped out of the car. The rain was colder than I expected. I pulled my jacket collar up slightly and walked behind my car to check the damage. The rear bumper was dented, and one of the taillights had cracked. It wasn't a serious accident, but it definitely wasn't nothing. The door of the sedan behind me opened, and a woman stepped out. She looked to be close to 40. Her dark hair was tied back, and her face clearly showed panic. "I'm so sorry," she said almost immediately. "I'm so sorry." She repeated the words so many times that I felt she was more frightened than actually explaining anything. I asked if she was hurt. She shook her head right away. I didn't feel injured either, aside from my heart beating a little faster from the surprise. "We should check the insurance," I said. The moment she heard the word insurance, her expression changed. I could see it clearly under the streetlight. She hesitated for a second, then spoke in a quieter voice. I don't have full coverage." I looked at her for a moment. In the back seat of her car, I saw a child seat. A small pink backpack sat beside it. She seemed to notice that I had seen it. "I have a daughter," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just finished my shift. I work at a hotel nearby." The rain continued to fall steadily around us. Cars passed through the intersection, but no one paid attention to the two vehicles pulled to the side. "My name is Maria," she added quickly. "Maria Alvarez." I nodded. "Luca," I replied. "Luca Bennett." She looked at my car, then back at me. "If you call the police or insurance, I might not be able to pay for this," she said. "I'm really sorry. I didn't see your brake lights." For a few seconds, we simply stood there in the rain. I could hear water dripping from the roof of a nearby store. In the United States, situations like this usually end in a very clear way. People call the police. Insurance companies get involved. If the damage is large, sometimes lawyers and lawsuits follow. I knew that. Maria knew it too. She looked at me with the eyes of someone waiting for something bad to happen. I looked at her old car. The paint had faded in several places. One door had a long scratch across it. This was clearly not the car of someone who had many options. Then I remembered my father. He used to tell me something when I was younger. Kindness is the only investment that always returns. I don't know why that sentence appeared in my mind right then. I looked at Maria and said something simple. "It's okay." She blinked, as if she didn't understand what I had just said. "I'm not going to sue you," I continued. Maria stared at me for a few seconds. Rain ran down her hair. You mean that?" she asked. I nodded. "It was just an accident." She raised her hand to cover her mouth. I think she was trying not to cry. I don't know what to say," she said. I shrugged slightly. Just drive more carefully next time. Maria nodded repeatedly. I will never forget this, she said. At that moment, I simply thought it had been a strange evening with a small accident. I walked back to my car, checked everything one last time, and prepared to drive away. I didn't know that years later, that same woman would become the person who helped pull me out of the darkest time of my life. The next morning when I woke up, the first thing I saw was the broken taillight of my car through the window overlooking the parking lot below. The weak Seattle sunlight hit the cracked plastic, making it look much more obvious than it had in the rain the night before. I stood by the window of my apartment near Lake Union for a few seconds, took a sip of coffee, and thought about the accident from last night. The truth was, if I wanted to, I could easily call my insurance company. I had full coverage. They would handle everything, and the woman from last night, Maria, might have to pay money she probably didn't have. That was simply how things usually worked in the United States. No one thought too much about it. It was just the process. But when I remembered the panic on her face under the streetlight, I found that I didn't want to do that. I left my apartment around 8 in the morning to go to work. Seattle mornings always have their own rhythm. Coffee shops were already open, and the smell of roasted coffee drifted onto the damp sidewalks. People hurried across the streets with thick jackets and paper cups in their hands. I drove to the office of the tech company where I worked in South Lake Union. The parking garage beneath the building was always busy. As I turned off the engine and stepped out, a coworker of mine, Kevin, walked past. "What happened to your car?" he asked as soon as he saw the broken taillight. "Someone hit me last night," I said. Kevin raised an eyebrow. "Did you call insurance?" "Not yet." He looked at me as if that answer was a little strange. "You should," he said. "That's why we have insurance." I nodded, but didn't say anything else. All morning I tried to focus on my work. The computer screen in front of me displayed familiar lines of code, but my mind kept returning to the image of the old sedan and the pink backpack in the back seat. There was something in Maria's eyes that made me feel like her life was already difficult enough. At lunchtime, I went downstairs to a cafe on the first floor of the building to buy a sandwich. While waiting in line, I pulled out my phone and looked at my call history. I realized I hadn't even asked Maria for her phone number. We had simply stood in the rain for a few minutes, exchanged a few words, and then driven away. I wasn't sure why that detail stayed in my mind. After work, I drove home. The broken taillight was still there, reminding me that last night's story hadn't been just a brief moment. When I parked in my building's lot, an older neighbor named Mr. Dawson was walking his dog. He looked at my car and smiled slightly. "Looks like someone bumped you," he said. "Yeah," I replied. "Did you call insurance yet?" I shook my head. Mr. Dawson shrugged. "Your choice," he said. "But in this city, people usually don't let things like that go." I nodded and said goodbye before heading up to my apartment. That evening, sitting alone in my living room, I remembered an old memory. I was about 12 years old when my father pulled our car to the side of the road to help a man change a flat tire. It was raining that day too. I remember asking him why we had stopped when we were in a hurry. My father simply smiled and said something simple. "You never know when life will bring people back together." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Years later, that sentence suddenly appeared in my mind as I thought about Maria. Maybe I would never see her again. Seattle was a big city. Millions of people passed each other every day without ever meeting again. But maybe not. A week later, I took my car to a small garage in Fremont to replace the taillight. The mechanic looked at the dented bumper and said fixing everything completely would cost much more than just replacing the light. "Your call," he said. "You want it fully repaired or just the light?" I looked at the car for a moment. "Just the light," I said. He nodded and went to work. While waiting, I sat on a plastic chair outside the garage. The Seattle sky was gray as usual. Cars passed along the small street. I thought about how our lives sometimes touch each other in very brief ways. A collision at an intersection. A conversation in the rain. And then everyone continues with their own life. When the mechanic returned and told me my car was ready, I paid and drove home. The new taillight shone brighter than the other one. On the way back, I stopped at a red light at another intersection in the city. For a moment, I looked into the rearview mirror. There was no old sedan behind me, just the familiar line of Seattle traffic in the afternoon. I drove on, thinking the story from that rainy night was probably over. I didn't know that it was only the beginning of a story that would take years for me to fully understand. After the accident that night, my life returned to its familiar rhythm. At least on the surface, everything seemed normal. I still woke up every morning, made coffee in my small kitchen, drove through the damp streets of Seattle, and sat in front of a computer screen for hours in an office in South Lake Union. But something had begun to change inside me, even though I didn't truly realize it at the time. Time passed faster than I expected. Weeks turned into months. Autumn faded, and Seattle moved into winter with its long gray days. The city was known for its lack of sunlight, and sometimes I felt that gray sky looked exactly like my mood. After my father passed away, I tried to keep everything in my life stable. I worked more. I took on extra projects at the company. I told myself that if I stayed busy long enough, the emptiness inside me would disappear. But it didn't disappear. It simply stayed there quietly, like a dark room in a house you try not to enter. At work, everyone still thought I was doing fine. I finished tasks on time. I attended meetings. Sometimes I even joked with coworkers. Kevin, the same coworker who had asked me about my broken taillight earlier, often worked at a desk near mine. One afternoon when we were both working late, he turned toward me and asked, "Are you okay, Luca?" I looked up from my screen. "Why do you ask?" "You just look tired lately." I gave a small smile. "Just a lot of work." Kevin nodded, but I could tell he didn't completely believe that answer. The truth was that I had started sleeping less. At first, it was just a few restless nights. Then gradually it became a pattern. I would lie in bed in my apartment, staring at the ceiling in the dark and thinking about many things I couldn't quite name. I thought about my father. I thought about the conversations we would never have again. I thought about how quickly life could change. And sometimes I thought about small things, like the accident with Maria, even though I didn't really understand why that memory occasionally returned. Winter in Seattle slowed everything down. The days became shorter. The evenings came earlier. Many afternoons when I left the office, the sky was already almost completely dark. I began avoiding my friends. When they invited me to dinner or drinks after work, I usually made excuses saying I was busy or tired. At first, they asked again. Eventually, they stopped asking. One morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and realized that I looked different. Not in an obvious way, but there was something in my eyes that felt unfamiliar. I looked like someone trying to keep everything from falling apart. Work at the company also began to feel heavier. Our company was growing quickly, which meant more projects, more pressure, and more late nights. Some days I stayed in the office until 9 or 10 at night. The computer screen glowed in a room that was almost empty. The sound of typing echoed quietly. At moments like that, I felt more like a machine than a person. One evening as I drove home across a bridge near Lake Union, I saw the lights of the city reflecting on the dark water. Seattle at night always had a quiet beauty. But instead of feeling calm, I only felt tired. In the following weeks, things became more difficult. I began missing a few morning meetings because I couldn't get out of bed on time. I read emails but didn't respond right away. Tasks that had once been easy for me now took much longer to finish. One afternoon, as I stared at my computer screen without really doing anything, Kevin turned to me again. "You sure you're okay?" he asked. This time, I didn't answer immediately. "I think I just need a few days off," I said after a moment. He nodded. Probably a good idea. Those few days quickly turned into a week. Then 2 weeks. I told the company I needed time to sort out some personal things. They were understanding. In the tech industry, burnout wasn't uncommon. But when I stayed home alone for too long, I realized that leaving work didn't make things better. My apartment became so quiet that sometimes I could hear the clock ticking in the living room. I began spending long periods just sitting on the couch, looking out the window and watching gray clouds move across the Seattle sky. Some days I didn't even leave the apartment. One morning, after looking into the mirror again and not liking the person staring back at me, I decided I needed to go outside. Not because I wanted to. But because I knew if I continued like that, things would only get worse. I put on my jacket, stepped out of my apartment, and walked a few blocks. The winter air was cold and damp, but at least it made me feel like I was back in the world. I drove toward downtown without any real destination in mind. Eventually, I parked near Pike Place Market. I thought maybe a hot cup of coffee in a small cafe might help me wake up a little. At that moment, I didn't know that that simple decision, just stopping for coffee, would lead me to a meeting I never expected. A meeting that would change the direction of the days that followed in my life. That morning, Seattle carried its familiar winter gray. Low clouds hung across the sky, and the damp, cold air made everything in the city look as if it were covered by a thin layer of mist. I drove slowly through the streets near downtown, not really having any plans for the day. I just knew I needed to get out. After spending many days barely leaving my apartment, driving through streets full of people suddenly felt a little strange. People hurried along the sidewalks. Small shops were open. The smell of roasted coffee drifted through the cold air around Pike Place Market. I found a parking spot nearby and turned off the engine. For a few seconds, I sat quietly in the car, watching people walk past. Some street musicians were setting up their instruments. A few tourists stood near the famous market sign taking photos. Life continued moving around me, as if I were just an observer standing outside of it. Eventually, I stepped out of the car and pulled my coat tighter. Wind from Puget Sound carried the familiar Seattle chill. I walked for a few minutes before stepping into a small coffee shop on a corner near Pike Place Market. The cafe wasn't large, but it felt warm. Soft yellow lights reflected off wooden tables. The sound of the espresso machine echoed behind the counter. I stood in line behind a few other customers. When it was my turn, I ordered a black coffee. While waiting for the drink, I stepped aside and looked out the window. Small drops of water began forming on the glass. Seattle was raining again. I had just taken the coffee handed to me when I heard a voice behind me. "Luca?" I thought I had heard it wrong. I turned around. A woman stood a few steps away from me. For a moment, it took me a second to recognize her. It was Maria. Her dark hair was tied back the same way it had been the last time I saw her. But her face no longer carried the panic I remembered from that rainy night under the streetlight. Instead, there was a small, surprised smile. "I wasn't sure, but I thought it might be you," she said. I was just as surprised. "Maria?" I asked. She nodded. "Yes." We stood there for a moment, both of us piecing together the memory of a rainy evening months earlier. "I didn't think we'd meet again," I said. Maria laughed softly. "Neither did I." She pointed at the coffee in my hand. "Do you live nearby?" "I live near Lake Union," I said. "Just passing through." Maria nodded. "I work nearby," she said. "The hotel where I work is a few blocks away." As we talked, I noticed that she looked much less tense than the last time I saw her. Her clothes were simple but neat. "Did you fix your car?" she asked. I looked down at the coffee cup and smiled slightly. "I just replaced the tail light." Maria exhaled as if she had just heard good news. "I've thought about that night many times," she said. "The accident." I shrugged. "It was just an accident." Maria shook her head slightly. "Not just that," she said. "You don't know how scared I was." We stood near the cafe window. Outside, the rain had begun to fall harder. "I thought if you called the police or insurance, I wouldn't know what to do," she said. I stayed quiet for a moment. "Is life better now?" I asked. Maria nodded. "Better than before." She paused for a second and then added, "My daughter still remembers you." I was slightly surprised. "Really?" "Yes," Maria said. "I told her about the man who forgave us." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just smiled. Maria looked at me for another few seconds. Then she tilted her head slightly. "Are you okay?" she asked. The question was simple, but it caught me off guard. "Why do you ask?" I said. Maria looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Because you don't look like someone who is okay." I was about to say she was wrong. I was about to say I was just tired. But somehow those words didn't come out. I simply shrugged. Maybe I just need coffee, I said. Maria smiled, but there was a knowing look in her eyes. Let me buy you another one, she said. I already have one. Then we can sit and talk for a bit. I looked around the cafe. There were a few empty tables near the window. For some reason, I nodded. We sat down at a small wooden table. Outside, rain fell over the rooftops of Pike Place Market. As Maria told me about her work at the hotel and about her daughter, I realized that it had been a long time since I had simply sat and talked to someone like this. No emails. No deadlines. Just a conversation. When we stood up to leave the cafe about half an hour later, Maria said something that stayed with me for a long time. I'm really glad I saw you today, she said. I nodded. Me too. But at that moment, I didn't yet know that that chance meeting in the small cafe would become the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would slowly change the way I saw my own life. After the unexpected meeting at the cafe near Pike Place Market, I thought everything would end there. A short conversation, a handshake, and then each of us returning to our own lives. Seattle was a big city, and unexpected encounters usually existed only for a moment. But this time it didn't. 2 days later, while I was sitting in my apartment looking out at the gray water of Lake Union, my phone vibrated. I looked at the screen. A message from an unknown number. Hi, Luca. This is Maria. I hope you don't mind that I found your number through the hotel where I work. Just wanted to ask how you're doing today. I read the message twice. I didn't know why Maria wanted to contact me. We had only talked for about half an hour in the cafe. But somehow that simple message made the quiet room feel a little less cold. I replied. I'm okay, thank you. I hope work isn't too busy today. The reply came only a few minutes later. I'm working the evening shift today, free this morning. If you have time, we could get coffee. I stared at the message for quite a while before responding. Part of me wanted to decline. I had become used to being alone. But another part of me thought maybe going outside again wouldn't be such a bad idea. Finally, I wrote, Sure, I'm near Pike Place. 30 minutes later, we were sitting in the same cafe again. Maria wore a simple gray coat. When she walked in, she looked around the cafe and smiled when she saw me. I hope I'm not bothering you, she said as she sat down. No, I replied. I was already in need of coffee. We talked about ordinary things. Maria told me about her job cleaning rooms at the hotel. The work wasn't easy, but she said at least it was stable. I used to work 2 jobs at once, she said. Now it's a little better. I asked about her daughter. Sophia is 8 now, Maria said, her eyes lighting up when she mentioned her child. She likes drawing and loves the ocean. She took out her phone and showed me a few photos. A little girl with dark hair smiling in front of a colorful painting. She knows about you, Maria said. I hope you didn't tell her the story about the accident, I joked. Maria shook her head. I told her there was a kind man who forgave us. I didn't know what to say, so I took a sip of coffee. After that day, we began meeting occasionally. Not every day, but every few days Maria would text and ask if I wanted to walk around or get coffee. At first I thought it was just politeness. But gradually I realized Maria truly cared. One morning she brought a small paper bag. What's that? I asked. Tamal, she said. I made it myself. I opened the bag. Inside were several warm pieces that still smelled like corn. I'm not sure I should accept this, I said. Maria shrugged. You helped me once. Let me help a little. We began walking more, sometimes around Pike Place, sometimes along the waterfront where we could see ferries moving across Puget Sound. Our conversations were usually simple. Maria talked about strange guests at the hotel. I talked about software projects she didn't fully understand but listened to anyway. Something strange happened during those weeks. I began leaving my apartment more often. I started sleeping a little better. I didn't think Maria was trying to help me. She simply showed up, talked, and carried a calm energy that I hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon as we sat on a bench near the ferry docks, Maria looked straight at me. You know, she said, when we first met, I thought my life was about to end. I think you're exaggerating, I said. Maria shook her head. No, I was really scared.
She looked out at the water.
I thought if you sued me, I would lose my car. If I lost my car, I would lose my job. If I lost my job, I wouldn't know how to support Sophia.
I didn't say anything. Maria turned back to me.
You helped me when I was at my worst. I shrugged. I just let an accident go.
Maria shook her head.
No, she said. You gave me a chance. We sat in silence for a moment. Seagulls circled above the water. Then Maria said something I never forgot. Maybe now it's my turn. My turn to do what? I asked. To help you, she said. I laughed lightly. I don't need help. Maria didn't argue. She simply said, one sentence. You don't have to say it. I can still see it. For the first time in months, I didn't know how to disagree with that. Because somewhere inside me, I knew she might be right. The weeks that followed moved with a new rhythm that I had never planned. I was still living in my small apartment near Lake Union, still waking up to Seattle's familiar gray mornings, but something had changed. I was no longer completely alone in my days. Maria began appearing in my life in very simple ways, not with big advice or deep conversations. She simply texted to ask what I was doing, or invited me to go for a walk if I had time. At first, I kept a certain distance. I wasn't used to someone caring about me in that way. For many months before that, I had grown accustomed to closing myself off, like a room with its door shut. But Maria didn't try to break that door down. She just stood outside and knocked gently. One morning, when I had just woken up, I received a message from her. The weather is less rainy today. Want to take a walk? I looked out the window. The Seattle sky was still gray, but it was true that it wasn't raining. I replied. Where? She answered almost immediately. Discovery Park. Discovery Park was one of the largest parks in Seattle. I had been there a few times before, but it had been a long time. An hour later, we met at the parking lot near the park entrance. Maria wore a thick, dark blue coat. When she saw me, she waved. It's cold today, she said as I walked closer. Seattle is always cold, I replied. We started walking along a dirt path leading toward the shoreline. Discovery Park was wide and quiet. Tall pine trees stood silently under the gray sky. We walked for quite a while without saying much. I realized that the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the quiet between two people who had become used to each other's presence. When we reached a wide, grassy area overlooking Puget Sound, Maria stopped. There's someone I want you to meet, she said. Me? I asked. Maria nodded. At that moment, a little girl ran toward us from across the field. She looked about 8 years old, with long, dark hair, holding a small kite. Mama, the girl called. Maria smiled. Sophia, she said. This is Luca. The girl stopped in front of me and looked at me with curious eyes. Are you the good man my mom told me about? She asked. I was slightly surprised by the question. I'm not sure about the good part, I said. But yes, my name is Luca. Sophia laughed. I knew it, she said. Mom said you helped us. Maria shook her head lightly, as if to say the girl was saying too much. She likes to talk, Maria said to me. I don't talk too much, Sophia protested. I just tell the truth. I couldn't help but laugh. We sat down on a wooden bench overlooking the ocean. Sophia ran out onto the grass to fly her kite while Maria and I watched her. She loves this place, Maria said. I understand, I replied. It's beautiful. After a while, Sophia ran back toward us. Luca, she said, do you want to try flying the kite? I hadn't flown a kite since I was a child, but I stood up. Sure, I said. Sophia handed me the spool of string. The wind from the sea was stronger than I expected, and the kite quickly lifted into the sky. Sophia laughed loudly. You did it! I looked at the kite rising in the wind and realized I was smiling too. A real smile. That surprised me. After Sophia ran off to play again, Maria looked at me. You see? She said. See what? You smiled. I smile all the time, I said. Maria shook her head gently. Not that kind of smile. I didn't answer.
We sat looking at the ocean for a while.
Finally, Maria said, "I know you're going through something."
"I'm fine," I said automatically. Maria didn't argue. She simply said softly,
"You don't have to be strong all the time."
I looked out at the gray water of Puget Sound. "I'm just a little lost," I said.
Maria nodded.
"That happens to everyone."
We sat there for a long time, watching ferries move slowly across the water. For the first time in many months, I felt a quiet space inside me that I had forgotten existed. Not because all my problems had disappeared, but because two people were sitting there with me, and they didn't expect me to be anyone other than myself. In the weeks after that afternoon at Discovery Park, my life continued to change in a slow but noticeable way. There was no magical moment that suddenly made everything better. There was no day when I woke up and felt that every problem inside me had disappeared. But little by little, my days began to look different. I went outside more. I walked more. I started replying to messages from friends. And sometimes, I even opened my computer again to do a little freelance work that I had ignored before. Maria continued to appear in those days in very simple ways. Sometimes it was a message in the morning. Sometimes it was a short walk after her work shift. Sometimes it was just a hot cup of coffee she placed in front of me at the familiar cafe near Pike Place Market. One evening, with light rain falling outside, we were sitting in that cafe again. The place was almost empty. Outside the glass window, yellow lights reflected on the wet street. Maria gently stirred her coffee but didn't drink it. I noticed she seemed to be thinking about something. "Is something wrong?" I asked. Maria looked at me, then looked out the window. "I want to tell you something," she said. I nodded. "What is it?" Maria took a deep breath. "After that accident, I thought about that night a lot." "Me too," I said. She smiled slightly, but not in the same way. She paused for a few seconds. "You know, that night I really thought my life was about to fall apart." I didn't say anything. Maria continued. "I was working 2 jobs. I had just moved to Seattle. I didn't have much money saved." She looked down at the table. "If you had called the police or insurance, they would have asked about my coverage. And when they found out I didn't have full insurance, I didn't know what would happen." "It might have just been a fine," I said. Maria shook her head. "Not just that." She looked at me. "I could have lost my car." She paused. "If I lost my car, I couldn't go to work." Her voice became quieter. "And if I lost my job, I didn't know how I would support Sophia." The cafe remained quiet. Only the sound of the coffee machine came from the counter. Maria looked straight at me. "That night I went home and cried," she said. I was slightly surprised. "Because of the accident?" Maria shook her head. "Because of you." I didn't understand. Maria continued. "You could have made my life much harder, but you didn't." She smiled softly. "I told Sophia that there are still good people in the world." I didn't know what to say. I simply shrugged. "It wasn't a big deal." Maria shook her head. "For you, maybe not. But for me, it changed everything." She looked out the window where the rain continued to fall. I started believing that maybe life wasn't completely against me. I stayed quiet. Maria turned back to me. "And then that day when I saw you again in the cafe," she smiled, "I realized you weren't okay." "I thought I hid it pretty well," I said. Maria shrugged. "People who have been through hard times recognize it in others." That sentence made me think for a moment. "I'm not sure I deserve help," I said. Maria looked at me as if that idea made no sense at all. "You helped me when I was at my worst," she said. I was about to argue, but Maria continued. "You gave me a second chance." She placed her hand on the table. "Now maybe it's my turn." "Your turn to do what?" I asked. "To help you remember that life can still be good." I smiled lightly. "That's a pretty big mission." Maria shook her head. "No," she said. She looked at me very seriously. "Sometimes it's enough just to have someone beside you." We sat quietly for a while. Finally, Maria said something I never forgot. "That night, you thought you were just forgiving an accident." She smiled. But to me, you saved my life. I looked out the window where the rain slid slowly down the glass. For many months, I had felt like I was sinking into a very dark place. But in that moment, I began to realize something. Maybe sometimes life isn't trying to pull us down. Maybe sometimes it's just waiting for someone to take our hand and pull us back. After that rainy evening in the cafe, I began to see the world around me a little differently. Not because the difficulties in my life had suddenly disappeared. I still had tired days. There were still mornings when I woke up feeling a heavy weight inside my chest. But now those days no longer lasted forever. Something in my life had begun to shift. I started going outside more. Walks in Discovery Park became a routine. Sometimes Maria and Sophia came with me. Sophia always brought her small kite, and whenever the wind from Puget Sound grew stronger, she would run across the grass with a bright smile. I usually stood behind her holding the spool while Sophia ran in circles. Simple moments like that were things I might not have noticed before. But now I realize that small things are sometimes what keep us standing. One afternoon, while we were sitting on the familiar wooden bench overlooking the ocean, Sophia turned to me. "Luca," she said, "when are you going back to work?" The question caught me by surprise. "Why do you ask?" I said. Sophia shrugged. "Mama says you're very good." Maria looked at her and laughed. That was a very direct question. I looked out at the water for a moment before answering. Maybe soon. And for the first time in a long while, I realized I meant it. A few weeks later, I started accepting small programming projects again from some old clients. They weren't big projects like the ones I used to handle at the company, but they were enough to bring me back into a working rhythm. More importantly, I no longer felt that everything was meaningless. One evening, while walking alone near the ferry terminal in downtown Seattle, I suddenly remembered the rainy night months earlier. The night when the old sedan crashed into my car at the intersection in Capitol Hill. At that time, I had thought I was simply letting go of a small accident. But what if I had chosen differently? What if I had called the police? What if I had called insurance? What if Maria had lost her car? What if she had lost her job? What if she had been forced to leave Seattle? We might never have met again. I might never have sat in that cafe on a winter morning. I might never have met Sophia running across the grass with her kite. And maybe, when I fell into the darkest period of my life, no one would have appeared to help pull me out of it. I stopped near the railing and looked out at Puget Sound. Ferries moved slowly across the dark water, their lights reflecting on the waves. My father once told me something when I was young. Kindness always comes back. At that time, I thought he was simply talking about doing the right thing. But now I understood he meant something bigger. Sometimes kindness doesn't return immediately. Sometimes it travels a long path through someone else's life. And then one day, when you need it most, it returns in a way you never expected. A week later, I met Maria and Sophia again at Discovery Park. The wind from the ocean was stronger than usual, and Sophia was trying to keep her kite from flying too high. When I walked toward them, Sophia waved. "Luca!" Maria turned and smiled. "You made it." I stood beside them, looking out at the ocean. After a few minutes, Maria said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That night," she said, "why didn't you sue me?" I thought for a moment. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Maybe because I remembered something my father said." Maria looked at me. "What did he say?" I looked at the kite flying high in the gray sky. "He said, kindness is the only investment that always returns." Maria smiled. It seems he was right. I looked at Sophia laughing across the grass. "Yes," I said. He was right. And for the first time in many years, standing in the sea wind of Seattle, I felt like I was no longer lost.